Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carlos DeBrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, February 20th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world and the racism we display to those we're killing. In accord with the Latin proverb, proprium humanae ingenii est odissi cum laceris. It's human nature to hate those you have injured. At this moment, the U.S. is making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. Thousands of U.S. troops are killing people in these countries, although most Americans are barely aware of it. More than 250,000 U.S. troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. bases on foreign soil. The 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. today is what M.L. King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, an international criminal surpassing all others. But most Americans don't know that, protected as they are by government and media propaganda. What we try to do here at Aware on the Air is talk about U.S. war-making. In the wake of last week's indictments alleging that 13 Russian nationals, 13 Russian citizens, and 3 Russian companies created fake social media accounts and sponsored events to sow political discord in the United States during the presidential campaign, something of a consensus has arisen in the political and media class in America that these actions not only constitute an act of war against the U.S., but one so grave that it's tantamount to Pearl Harbor and 9/11. Indeed, that Russia's alleged meddling is comparable to the 2 most devastating attacks in U.S. history has overnight become a virtual cliché. If you think I'm exaggerating, look at the lead articles by columnists in the New York Times and the Washington Post yesterday, one of which says that the Russian meddling is equivalent to Pearl Harbor. The other one says it's equivalent to 9/11, and they both say the U.S. should retaliate. The claim that Russian meddling is an act of war comparable to those events isn't brand new. Senators from both parties, such as Republican John McCain and Democrat Jeanne Shaheen, have long described Russian meddling in 2016 as, quote, an act of war, close quote. Hillary Clinton, while promoting her book last October, described Russia's alleged hacking of the DNC and John Podesta's email inbox, Podesta was her campaign manager, as cyber 9/11. And last February, the always war-hungry Tom Friedman of the New York Times said that Russian hacking, quote, was a 9/11 scale event. They attacked the core of our democracy. That was a Pearl Harbor scale event, close quote. But the last few days have ushered in an explosion of this rhetoric from politicians and journalists alike. On Friday night's Chris Hayes show on MSNBC, 2 separate guests, Democratic Congressman Jerry Nadler and longtime Clinton aide Philippe Brines, posited Pearl Harbor as the equivalent of Russian meddling, provoking a shocked reaction from Hayes. The Washington Post's Karen Tumulty, complaining about Trump's inaction, asked readers to, quote, imagine how history would have judged Franklin Roosevelt in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor if he had taken to the radio airwaves to declare that Tokyo was laughing their asses off. Or if George W. Bush had stood in the rubble of the World Trade Center with a bullhorn and launched a name-calling tirade against the Democrats. Close quote. David Frum, responsible for the Axis of Evil talk, went back a century earlier to write that Trump's inaction amounts to, quote, a dereliction of duty as grave as any since President Buchanan looked the other way as southern state governments pillaged federal arsenals on the eve of the Civil War, close quote. John Podesta, who served as Bill Clinton's chief of staff, as well as Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign chairman, called Trump a draft dodger for failing to engage what he called this war with Russia, complaining that Trump had not struck back at Russia. Let's leave aside what a stinging indictment this claim is of the Obama presidency. It not only means that Obama allowed an attack on the magnitude of Pearl Harbor and 9/11 to happen on his watch, but worse, did very little, basically nothing, in response, allegedly due to fears that any retaliation would be criticized by Republicans as partisan. But for those who really believe this rhetoric, can fears of political attacks really justify inaction by the commander-in-chief, whose primary duty, we're so often told, is to protect the nation, in the face of a Pearl Harbor or 9/11? To posit this equivalence is to condemn Obama in the harshest possible terms, to accuse him of utter malfeasance in protecting our nation. But the more important question is the one these chest-beating politicians and pundits notably refrain from addressing. If Russian election meddling is on a par with Pearl Harbor and 9/11 attacks, then should the U.S. response be on par with its response to those attacks? Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor prompted U.S. involvement in a world war and ultimately dropping 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. 9/11 initiated wars in multiple countries that still, 17 years later, have no end in sight, along with a systematic and still worsening erosion of basic civil liberties. This has been a long-standing tactic during the war on terror of neoconservatives. They love to accuse everyone of being insufficiently tough or aggressive with whatever country they craved heightened tensions. But they never specify what greater toughness is needed, because to do so would expose their extremism. Indeed, for years, GOP hawks such as John McCain, Marco Rubio, and Jeb Bush often accused Obama of being insufficiently tough on the Russians, of being too weak to stand up to the Russian leader, without specifying what they wanted him to do beyond arming Ukrainians. Regarding Obama's alleged weakness towards Putin, McCain said in 2014 that, quote, history will judge this administration incredibly harshly, close quote. The only specific proposal one hears now, when it comes to responding to Russian meddling, is a call for sanctions. But if one really believes that Russia's actions amount to Pearl Harbor or 9/11, then sanctions seem like a very lame, indeed a wholly inadequate, response. To borrow their rhetoric, imagine if Roosevelt had confined his response to Pearl Harbor to sanctions on Japanese leaders, or if Bush had announced sanctions on al-Qaeda as his sole response to 9/11. If you really believe this rhetoric, then you must support retaliation beyond mere sanctions. Indeed, Obama imposed sanctions on Russia for years, but critics like McCain insisted that it had no hope of changing Putin's behavior, let alone imposing any real punishment. Quote, the only thing that will dissuade Vladimir Putin from what he is doing is when coffins come back to the families in Russia, close quote, McCain said of Russia's annexation of Crimea. At least McCain, for all his faults, is following his rhetoric through to its logical conclusion. If you really believe that Putin attacked the U.S., on a level even close to what was done at Pearl Harbor or on 9/11, then of course you'd be arguing for retaliation far greater than sanctions. You'd be arguing for military action, such as arming Russia's enemies, if not beyond that, as McCain had done. You'd also be furious with Obama for allowing it to happen on his watch and then doing so little in response, as McCain is. All of this underscores the serious dangers many have pointed to for more than a year about why all this unhinged rhetoric is so alarming. If you really believe that Russia, with some phishing links set to John Podesta and some fake Facebook ads and Twitter bots, committed an act of war of any kind, let alone one on par with Pearl Harbor and 9/11, then it's inevitable that extreme retaliatory measures will be considered and likely triggered. How does one justify a mere imposition of sanctions in the face of an attack similar to Pearl Harbor or 9/11? Doesn't it stand to reason that something much more belligerent, enduring, and destructive would be necessary? At the very least, no politician or pundit should be able to get away with issuing rhetoric of this type without being required to specify what they think ought to be done. Here, for instance, is Meet the Press host Chuck Todd decreeing in a predictably viral tweet that all patriotic Americans are duty-bound to focus on the question of what we should do to, quote, punish Russia, close quote. Note, though, that Todd himself neglects to specify what punishment he advocates. This is reckless rhetoric of the most irresponsible kind, demanding that everyone agree that punishment towards Russia is warranted, upon pain of being found guilty of bad citizenship, while failing to specify what punishment would be just, warranted, and rational. To do that is to deliberately beat the drums of war, cultivate an atmosphere of belligerence and aggression without any limits or notions of proportionality. That's exactly what's being done by those who keep declaring the U.S. to be at war with Russia, and especially those who invoke the worst attacks in U.S. history when doing so, all while refusing to state what they think should be done in response. It's simultaneously reckless and cowardly. Meanwhile, a top U.S. admiral issued a warning on the possibility of war between the United States and China. President Donald Trump's pick for the next ambassador to Australia, Admiral Harry Harris Jr., last week, told Congress China has a, quote, crystal clear intent to dominate the South China Sea, and we're building military bases that could pose a threat to the U.S. China, he alleged, is using, quote, military modernization, influence operations, and predatory economics to coerce neighboring countries to reorder the Indo-Pacific to their advantage, close quote. Harris Jr., 62 years old, a highly decorated combat naval officer, has served in the Navy for 39 years. He holds a master's degree from Georgetown School of Foreign Service and attended Oxford University, according to a White House statement that accompanied his encouragement of war against China. We've said before on this program that you get a long enough focus, you see that American foreign policy remains remarkably similar over more than a century, an attempt to contain Eurasia, an attempt to keep Russia and China from economically developing to the point where they could threaten the profits of the American 1% who've been exploiting Eurasia since the open door policy of 1899. When this is the center of American foreign policy, it's not surprising that we have madmen like this admiral and John McCain and others claiming that we have to get our war on against Russia or China, your choice. The U.S. really seems determined to provoke a war against Russia. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov issued a stark warning to the U.S. this Monday, saying Washington should not play with fire in the region. Quote, The U.S. should stop playing very dangerous games which could lead to a dismemberment of the Syrian state, Lavrov said at a Middle East conference in Moscow on Monday. The U.S. is in the process of creating a Kurdish-led protection force, that's what they call it, consisting of 30,000 people in northeast Syria. Syrian President Bashar Assad's supporters, which include Russia and Iran, has said the U.S. move to support the Kurds in the area is aimed at creating an American zone of influence. Russia and Iran are present insofar as they are in Syria quite legally, the invitation of a legitimate government. Washington is an invader. Washington, the United States, is in Syria without invitation or legal right. A U.S. strike in Syria on pro-Assad forces, of the Damascus government, earlier this month may have killed numerous Russian mercenaries. Russian contractors, as we would say, who are working in Syria legally. With Turkey now embarking on a military offensive in Syria's northwest Afrin district. And just this morning it's reported that troops from Damascus, from the legitimate government in Syria, perhaps militias, have entered Afrin in opposition to the Turkish invasion. So it's a very serious situation. These are pro-government, pro-Damascus, pro-Syrian government troops moving into what is technically part of their country, but it's been invaded by Turkey, annoyed by the Kurds and the United States. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, makes it clear that Russia demands the withdrawal of the U.S. from areas it controls in other parts of Syria. U.S. troops must immediately shut down their zone of control in southern Syria in the area of Al-Tanf, Russian Minister Sergei Lavrov said, speaking at a conference in the Middle East in Moscow. The area that he's talking about is on Syria's border with Jordan, which Washington designated as a deconfliction zone under its protection. It hosts the Rukban refugee camp. Russia believes the camp to be a recruiting ground for militant groups and blames the U.S. for restricting humanitarian access to the camp. This zone must be shut down immediately, and deliveries of humanitarian aid must be allowed into the campus, the Russian minister said. Lavrov added that efforts aimed at reducing violence in southwestern Syria, in an area that Russia designated as a de-escalation zone, now must focus on pushing out all non-Syrian troops from that region. Quote, "We negotiated the creation of this zone with Jordan and the U.S., and it's not a secret that our Israeli colleagues were informed about what we discussed," the Russian minister said. Israel accuses Iran of using proxy forces to seize control of parts of southern Syria and has threatened to use military force to reverse the situation. A complex military situation in both the north and south of Syria, but what they have done has brought the Russians and the Americans into opposition and even military opposition in Syria. The Russians in support of the Syrian government and the Americans as an invader. This is a very dangerous situation, and these areas that we've been speaking of need to be watched closely for the events that occur there that we don't get too clear an account of at all in American mainstream media. The 7-year-old war waged against Syria. I should identify ourselves here. You're watching Aware on the Air, our weekly discussion of the war news, the wars that the United States is engaged in around the world, which are wretchedly reported by the American mainstream media, including any account of the Syrian situation that I just offered. The 7-year-old war waged against Syria ought to be over by now. The war waged by jihadist groups sponsored by the United States. The jihadist forces backed by the United States, Israel, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia were nearly all chased out of the country. The combination of Syrian, Iranian, and Hezbollah forces utilized Russian air protection to their advantage, and ISIS, for example, part of these forces, was on the run. All of the elements needed to bring peace to this country were in place. Far from being the evil force that Americans have been told to fear, Russia took the lead in winning the peace and in seeking a settlement among the various Syrian factions. Donald Trump made a campaign pledge not to seek regime change in Syria, but he's fallen in line with American imperialism and with his Israeli and Saudi allies. If they can't unseat President Assad, they are determined to carve Syria into their own spheres of influence, sometimes called balkanization, breaking up the Syrian government into the Syrian state, into different regions ruled by some of these various factions. The revolt against the Syrian government that began in 2011 was sponsored by the United States, which paid for Muslim terrorist forces from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and elsewhere to enter Syria and attack the Syrian government. Russia reversed that. But the story is not over at all. Peace is the last thing that the various players in the region attacking the Syrian government want to see. Turkey is always the wild card. Turkey has now invaded northern Syria, first among the regime changers, then against them, then using a fight against the Kurds to snatch its own territory. This is in the north of Syria, where Turkey has invaded on the grounds that the Kurds threaten them. In just 1 week, a Russian pilot was killed by jihadists. A United States airstrike killed 100 Syrians, it was claimed. The number is probably smaller, but still. And Israel and Iran played a dangerous tit-for-tat as they carried out attacks against one another. There can be no discussion about Syria that does not put the United States at the center of the conflict. Without American backing, none of the other war makers would have ever dared to lift a finger. Barack Obama took the lead in the plot, but then demurred against further escalation in the face of British faltering and perhaps his own fear of the outcome. Trump is surely the most pro-Israel in a long line of presidents. He goes along with the influential lobby with complete conviction. Syria is not the only target in the effort. Iran is also in Trump's crosshairs as he keeps alive the 40-year-old campaign to destroy that country. Of course, Israel is implicated in any anti-Iranian activity, and as the only nuclear power in the region, always poses great danger to the entire world. The potential for conflict is ripe as the United States is determined to throw a wrench into any process that might lead to peace. Worse yet, there's silence in the United States Congress and blatant warmonger cheerleading in the corporate media. Leftish Democrats, who at one time could be counted on to at least ask questions, are long gone. Supposed progressives, like Bernie Sanders, support war, and Zionist members of the House of Representatives and Senate are happy to join Trump in supporting anything that Israel wants. The nonstop Russophobia, fear and hatred of Russia, from the corporate media and politicians has done its damage. Anything that the Russian government wants has been labeled as evil, and Democrats are happy to join Trump in bringing the world to the brink of major war. While Americans are told that Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un are threats to peace, it's American presidents who put the world in danger. The name may be Clinton, Bush, Obama, or Trump, but the result is the same: chaos and death in pursuit of full-spectrum dominance, as the Pentagon says. American presidents get away with their criminality because they govern an uninformed and confused populace. It's not all their fault. The media make us uninformed and confused. The average American is captive to corporate media. Corporate media lies and never looks elsewhere for information. Any narrative that counters the official story is deliberately disappeared from view, and the result is ignorance and a tiny, ineffective anti-war movement, such, I'm afraid, as Aware. All of the ingredients are present for a great tragedy, unless the people speak up. The imperialists learned their lesson from Iraq, and know better than to fully commit large-scale troop deployments as Bush did. That's always a cause for public dissent and possible electoral defeat. Wars by proxy get a pass from people who care little about body counts unless they're American victims. But the anti-war movement has no choice but to step up. Our numbers are small, but there must be a commitment to stop the slow-motion catastrophe from going any further. Any lingering connections with the Democratic Party must end once and for all. They will gladly go along with plans for war in Syria or elsewhere. The commitment must be to end United States interventions and declare independence from anyone who is not firmly opposed to crimes cooked up in Washington. Every American president escalates what his predecessors began, and now the world is on a precipice. It's a daunting task to revive a movement that has withered so badly. The odds aren't good, but inaction makes them worse. What was once hyperbole is now reality. The United States has endangered the entire planet, and only ordinary people can stop the catastrophe. These remarks are from Margaret Kimberly, who writes for Black Agenda Report, and her comments can be read there, and also on the Facebook page for Aware. You're watching Aware on the Air, and we're talking about American war making and its sources. The columnist, political columnist who calls himself the Saker, Saker's a bird, Saker has a good comment, it seems to me, on this point under the title, "How Far Can the Russians Be Pushed?" He says, "I'm starting to believe that the empire," he means, of course, the U.S., "has decided to attempt a partial reconquista of Syria, reconquest of Syria. Even Macron, French President Macron, is making some noises about striking the Syrians to punish them for the use of non-existing chemical weapons. At the very least, the U.S. wants to make the Russian pay as high a price as possible for their role in Syria. Further U.S. goals in Syria include the imposition of a de facto partition of Syria by taking under control the Syrian territory east of the Euphrates River, the theft of the gas fields located in northeastern Syria, the creation of a U.S.-controlled staging area from which Kurdish, good terrorists and bad terrorist operations alike, can be planned and executed, the sabotaging of any Russian-backed peace negotiations, the support for Israeli operations against Iranian and Hezbollah forces in Lebanon and Syria, engaging in regular attacks against Syrian forces attempting to liberate their country from foreign invaders, and presenting the invasion and occupation of Syria as one of the victories promised by Trump to the military-industrial complex and the Israel lobby. So far, the Russian response to this developing strategy has been a rather passive one, and the current escalation strongly suggests that a new approach might be needed. The shooting down of the Israeli F-16 is a good first step, but much more needs to be done to dramatically increase the costs the empire will have to pay for its policy towards Syria. The increase in the number of Russian commentators and analysts demanding a stronger reaction to the current provocations might be a sign that something is in the making. Listen to what you can of the news from Syria in mainstream media this week, there is a real sense that things are on the cusp. Meanwhile, here at home, you're listening to Aware on the Air, and a specter is haunting Western democracy. The specter of divisiveness. After 8 blessed years of peace and prosperity, under the glorious reign of Obama the Benevolent, suddenly we find ourselves besieged on all sides by Russian-sponsored sowers of discord, disseminators of disinformation, inculcators of confusion and chaos, and other enemies of our democratic values. These devilish instigators of disunion and distrust are determined to deceive us into doubting the truth by exposing us to divisive ideas and seducing us with their cynical skepticism into questioning the integrity of our personal leaders, our intelligence agencies, and the corporate media, who would never, ever dream of lying to us. Or so goes the new official narrative being rolled out by the corporatocracy. Corporatocracy, made up Greek word, means rule by corporations, rule by the 1%. The effective rule, the real rule in the United States. It is utterly stupefying to watch as millions of Americans conform their beliefs and behavior to the official party, to the official narrative, like inner party members in the novel 1984. If you haven't read George Orwell's 1984, this unfortunately may be a good time to do it. The inner party members in that novel are the people who are the source of the official narrative of what's going on in that alternate world. Apart from the fact that its storyline is simplistic and childish to the point of absurdity, that's the storyline of our political establishment, not the storyline of Orwell's novel, which isn't that way. The account that we get of world politics from the American political establishment focused through the media, that's what's childish and simplistic. It's only been roughly 16 years since the corporatocracy introduced the beta version of this same official narrative, the war on terror, to which millions of Americans obediently conformed, which resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands, the destabilization of the entire Middle East, and the transformation of most Western societies into militarized surveillance states. The war on dissent being rolled out currently is an expansion on the war on terror narrative, the storyline of which was equally childish and simplistic and blatantly fabricated. Though it's fashionable these days for the politicians and corporate media propagandists who sold the Saddam has weapons of mass destruction story, and the Iraq is linked to al-Qaeda lie, and the we're fighting terrorism in Afghanistan fairy tale, to regret how they misinterpreted the intelligence that led to the unfortunate blunder that launched the global corporatocracy's occupation and restructuring of the Middle East 15 years ago, which considers unabated today, anyone with half a brain could see what was really going on at the time. You didn't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that the war on terror was not a war on terrorism. The concept is nonsensical on its face, but rather was just the official narrative that would allow the global capitalist ruling classes to A, employ the United States military to pursue their aims throughout the world with more or less complete impunity, and B, designate anyone opposing the hegemony of global capitalism a terrorist. Several million of us figured that one out, or at least figured out the U.S. government, the intelligence community, and the corporate media were using Americans' emotional response to the September 11th terrorist attacks to con us into supporting the invasion and destabilization of the Middle East for reasons that had nothing to do with terrorism. So we did what Americans are taught to do. We peaceably assembled to petition our government, as did millions of people across the world, and otherwise raised as much ruckus as we could about how folks were being manipulated and were denounced as traitors or terrorist sympathizers and conspiracy theory nuts for our efforts, and not just by the corporatocracy, but also by regular good Americans. All these years later, knowing what we know, you might assume that all those good Americans who rushed out to buy American flags to wave as our troops destroyed a country, Iraq, that posed no threat to us whatsoever and had nothing to do with the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, because the corporate media and the intelligence community told them Saddam was going to nuke Kansas City, say. You might assume that all these good Americans, ashamed of having been made fools of by a bunch of television talking heads and papers of record like the New York Times, you might think these folks who, after all, are not complete idiots, the corporatocracy can just hoodwink over and over again, using more or less the same bag of tricks. You might naturally assume that these good Americans would give us the benefit of the doubt this time. That is, those of us who are challenging the narrative the corporate media has been ramming down our throats since Hillary Clinton lost the election. But no, nothing of the sort. No, this time we're not terrorist sympathizers, we're Putin sympathizers, Russian operatives, or at the very least we're useful idiots who are helping Russia destroy democracy by sowing discord, disunity, division, and other forms of dissent throughout the West. This is the essential feature of our new and improved official narrative. The basic storyline has not changed. It's still democracy versus the terrorists. The global capitalist ruling classes are simply expanding the already arbitrary and meaningless definition of terrorism, or rather, and more broadly, extremism. This is a natural, predictable progression which the ruling classes have been preparing us for. After 16 years of living in fear of the terrorists who, quote, hate us for our freedom, close quote, we're being introduced to a new official enemy. A new, yet familiar official enemy. An official enemy all good Americans are pre-programmed to hate and fear. Yes, that's right, folks. The Ruskies are back. Only this time without the communism. No, this time their diabolical goal is the destruction of democracy itself. Why exactly the Ruskies want to destroy democracy is not entirely clear, especially as it would collapse their economy, not to mention precipitate a nuclear war that would wipe out most forms of life on the planet. But you know they're inscrutable, those Ruskies. According to experts in the corporate media and our corporate-sponsored representatives in government, and it goes without saying, the intelligence community, the primary weapon the Ruskies are using to destroy democracy and life on Earth is the sowing of divisiveness and discord and distrust of our government and corporate elites who love us as they love their own children and who would never try to manipulate us or treat us like interchangeable commodities, or bankrupt us with their Ponzi schemes, or debt enslave our families for profit, or any other horrible things like that. This is the type of mindless hogwash Americans are being pressured to swallow, and in fact are swallowing, millions of them. But then this is how propaganda works. It doesn't have to make any sense. In fact, it's usually more effective if it doesn't. In profoundly authoritarian cultures, like the contemporary USA, people tend to believe the authorities, particularly when they're all repeating the same simple message over and over. People want to believe the authorities. They want to because they've been conditioned to want to from the time they were children, by their parents, teachers, political leaders, the corporate media, television, Hollywood, cultural icons, and more or less every other ideological organ of, quote, normal society, close quote. That's why when it's time to whip up popular support for a war of aggression, or a war against anyone expressing dissent, all the ruling classes have to do is make up an emotionally loaded narrative with a halfway believable official enemy and have their, quote, authoritative media sources, close quote, repeat it over and over and over in 1,000 different iterations, each repetition reifying the others until the narrative becomes the axiomatic truth, which no respectable, normal person would ever even think of wanting to question. In fact, once an official narrative has become the axiomatic truth, it can be rather dangerous psychologically if these respectable persons are confronted with evidence that demonstrates that the official narrative, or in other words, their reality, is based on, well, a load of horse manure. But as by this time, they've forgotten it's fiction and thus generally believe the lies they're telling. If you'd like to see an example of this in action, take a few minutes and watch what happens to Luke Harding, author of the book Collusion, when he's interviewed by Aaron Maté. I'll put the clip of this vital interview on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air. What you will witness is Harding melting down as his collusion narrative, the premise of his book. He's written a book called Collusion about the collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. What you witness is the author melting down as his collusion narrative falls to pieces under Maté's questioning, which remains collegial and calm throughout. Clearly, it had never occurred to Harding that anyone would question the Russiagate narrative, and especially not someone else in the business, as mainstream journalists are trained to accept and parrot whatever the ruling classes tell them. When he finally realizes what is happening, i.e. that his reality is melting away like your face in the mirror on a bad acid trip, he calls Maté a collusion rejectionist and abruptly ends the interview. This is just the kind of thing the corporatocracy wants to eliminate or relegate to the margins of the internet. They can't have journalists like Aaron Maté running around punching holes in their narrative, or at least not where normal Americans can see it. It's all fine and good to have folks like Hannity and Alex Jones jabbering about deep state conspiracies, as normal Americans don't take them seriously. But rational journalists like Maté, if they're not going to cooperate with the official narrative, well, they need to be censored or algorithmically deranked or otherwise marginalized, and the sooner the better. Which is exactly what the corporatocracy is doing and what they intend to continue doing until unity, harmony, and trust is restored. And this is just the beginning, folks. If you want to get a glimpse of our dystopian future, read this recent piece in The Atlantic, the magazine. It's by Representative Will Hurd of Texas, but it conveys the sentiments of the corporate ruling classes and their loyal servants in government generally. I won't spoil it for you. I'll put a link on the Facebook page for Aware. But here's one quote. Quote, "To address continued Russian disinformation campaigns, we need to develop a national counter-disinformation strategy. The strategy needs to span the entirety of government and civil society to enable a coordinated effort to counter the threat that influence operations pose to our democracy. It should implement similar principles to those of the Department of Homeland Security's strategy for countering violent extremism, with a focus on truly understanding the threat and developing ways to shut it down." Close quote. He's talking about reporting. That's what has to be shut down if it sows disunity. The message couldn't possibly be clearer. If you've enjoyed the Department of Homeland Security over the course of these last 16 years since it was invented, the constant low-level paranoia, the invasive searches, the body scans, the TSA agents groping your kids, the cops and soldiers standing around in public places in body armor with their assault raider rifles in the sling-ready position, you know what that is, the NSA listening in on your phone calls, and all the other features of the war on terror, you're going to love the war on dissent. You're watching Aware on the Air, one of the few places where we're talking about what's coming. Washington is, in fact, moving inevitably on the lines of its global war plan. That's the grim conclusion one has to draw from three unfolding war scenarios right now. Ultimately, it's about American imperialism trying to assert hegemony over the international order for the benefit of U.S. capitalism, the 1%. Russia and China are the prime targets for this global assault. The three unfolding war scenarios are seen in Syria, North Korea, and Ukraine. These are not disparate, disassociated conflicts. They're interrelated expressions of the American war plans which involve the moving of strategic military power into position. Last week's massacre of over 100 Syrian government forces by American warplanes near Deir ez-Zor, that's in eastern Syria, was an audacious, overt assault by the U.S. on the Syrian state. The U.S., along with other NATO allies, has been up to now waging a 7-year proxy war for regime change against Russia's ally, President Assad of Syria. The massacre last week was certainly not the first time that U.S. forces illegally present in Syria, have attacked the Syrian army. But it seems clearer than ever now that American forces are operating on the overt agenda for regime change. U.S. troops are transparently acting like an occupation army, challenging Russia and its legally mandated support for the Syrian state. Heightening international concerns are multiple reports that Russian military contractors were among the casualties in the U.S.-led airstrike near Deir ez-Zor last week. Regarding North Korea, Washington is brazenly sabotaging diplomatic efforts underway between the respective Korean leaderships in Pyongyang and Seoul, the North Korean and South Korean capitals. While this inter-Korean dialogue has been picking up positive momentum, the U.S. has all the while been positioning nuclear-capable B-52 and B-2 bombers in the region, along with at least 3 aircraft carriers. The B-2s are also reportedly armed with 14-ton bunker buster bombs, the largest non-nuclear warhead in the American arsenal, designed to destroy North Korean underground missile silos and decapitate the Pyongyang leadership of Kim Jong-un. American Vice President Mike Pence, while attending the Winter Olympics in South Korea, delivered a blunt war message. He said the recent détente between North Korea and U.S. ally South Korea will come to an end as soon as the Olympic flame is extinguished, Pence's words. This U.S. policy of belligerence completely upends Russia and China's efforts to facilitate inter-Korean peace diplomacy. Meanwhile, the situation in eastern Ukraine looks excitingly grim for an imminent U.S.-led invasion of the breakaway Donbass region. That's the eastern part of Ukraine. Pentagon military inspectors have in the past week reportedly arrived along the contact zone that separates the U.S.-backed Kiev regime forces and the pro-Russian separatists of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. So the eastern part of Ukraine that refused to accept the government installed by the coup that the U.S. supported in the capital, Kiev. Donetsk military commander Edward Basurin warned that the arrival of Pentagon and other NATO military advisors from Britain and Canada indicate that U.S. armed Kiev forces are readying for a renewed assault on the Donbass ethnic Russian population. Even the normally complacent observers of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, charged with monitoring a nominal ceasefire along the contact zone, have lately been reporting serious advancement of heavy weapons by the Kiev forces in violation of the 2015 Minsk Peace Accord. If the U.S.-led Kiev forces proceed with the anticipated offensive next month in Donbass, there are real fears for extreme civilian casualties. The war has already killed perhaps 10,000 people. Such ethnic cleansing of Russian people by Kiev regime forces that openly espouse neo-Nazi ideology would mostly likely precipitate a large-scale intervention by Moscow as a matter of humanitarian defense. Perhaps that is what the U.S. planners are wagering on, which can then be portrayed by the dutiful Western news media as, quote, another Russian aggression, close quote. It's undeniable that Washington is on a war footing in 3 global scenarios. Preparation for war is, in fact, war. You have to also consider the latest nuclear posture review published by the Pentagon earlier this month. The Pentagon is openly declaring that it views Russia and China as targets and is willing to use nuclear force to contest conventional wars and what the Pentagon deems to be asymmetric aggression, i.e., that is, we started. It's not clear at this stage exactly what Washington is doing, or, by the way, who's actually running things in Washington. It's, of course, all about seeking global domination, which is long consistent with American imperialism, as expressed, for example, in the Wolfowitz doctrines following the end of the Cold War. But what does Washington want specifically from Russia and China is the question. It's evidently using the threat of war and aggression as a lever, but it's not clear what would placate Washington. Perhaps regime change in Russia, where President Putin is ousted by a deferential pro-Western figure. Perhaps Russia and China giving up their plans of Eurasian economic integration and abandoning their plans to drop the American dollar in trade relations. One thing, however, seems abundantly clear. The U.S. is embarking, as continuing, a global war plan, as can be discerned from the grave developments unfolding in Syria, the Korean Peninsula, and Ukraine. Each scenario can be understood as a pressure point on Moscow or China to in some way acquiesce to American ambitions for global dominance. To be sure, Washington is brazenly acting like a rogue regime without the slightest hint of shame. Still, Russia and China are hardly likely to capitulate, simply because the U.S. ambition of unipolar hegemony, one country basically running the world, is impossible to achieve. The post-Second World War order, which Washington was able to dominate for nearly 7 decades, is becoming obsolete as the international order naturally transforms into a multipolar configuration. When Washington accuses Moscow and Beijing of, quote, trying to alter the international order to their advantage, close quote, what the American rulers are tacitly admitting is their anxiety that the days of U.S. hegemony are on the wane. Russia and China are not doing anything illegitimate. It's simply a fact of historical evolution. So ultimately, Washington's war plans are futile and that they're trying to achieve by criminal coercion. In what they're trying to achieve by criminal coercion in the places mentioned, Syria, Ukraine, and North Korea. Those plans cannot reverse history, but demonically, those plans could obliterate the future of the planet. The world is again on a precipice, as it was before on the eves of the First and Second World War. Capitalism, imperialism, and fascism are again center stage. The American rulers are coming out of the closet to show their true naked nature of wanting to wage war on the world. Their supremacist, militarist ideology is incontrovertibly fascism in action. You're listening to Aware on the Air. Our task is to talk about the prospect for war that is a result of American policy. There are some very few, very small anti-war voices in the American government. One of the most interesting, if disturbing in some ways, of them is Representative Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii. She's a Democrat congresswoman from Hawaii, and she was interviewed on a peculiar program recently called The Intercept by one Jeremy Scahill. Scahill asked her about her support for American war-making, specifically the drone warfare, the drone assassinations of the Obama administration. Gabbard's response was, so with these terrorist cells, for example, yes, I do still believe that the right approach is to take these quick strike forces, surgical strikes in and out very quickly, no long-term deployment, no long-term occupation to be able to get rid of the threat that exists, and then get out. And the very limited use of drones in those situations where our military is not able to get in without creating an unacceptable level of risk, and where you can make sure that you're not causing, a large amount of civilian casualties. Now look, close quote. That's Tulsi Gabbard, nobody's fool, but the most anti-war voice in the Congress. What she's approving here in this interview is essentially the drone assassination program of the Obama administration, the program that Noam Chomsky called the most extreme terrorist campaign of the modern world. The drone assassinations by Obama that observed no boundaries of war theaters and killed perhaps 5,000 people by the say-so of the President of the United States. While many on the left, so to speak, have applauded Gabbard's anti-interventionism, her criticism of the wars that the Obama administration ran, some of her other foreign policy stances have also angered the left and received praise from conservatives. She has, for example, argued in support of the global war on terror, a position antithetical to her anti-war image. Ask if she still favors a small footprint approach with limited use of weaponized drones against groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda. Gabbard said, with these terror cells, for example, yes, I believe that the right approach is to take these quick strike forces, surgical strikes in and out very quickly, no long-term deployment, etc. The account is disheartening, because she has been one of the few voices in the Congress that have been saying these things. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 8th week of 2018. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is U.S. worldwide war-making. My thanks tonight to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research. See No's notes on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air, along with articles referred to tonight and links to Aware's anti-war teach-in on YouTube and other things, including Nicholson Baker's important article, Why I Am a Pacifist, The Myth of the Good War. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young. Thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans, Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, Ed Mendel, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.